Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast. I'm Eric Rivenis. Thank you for staying subscribed and for listening wherever you're listening on your morning or afternoon commute, your treadmill, using the podcast to fall asleep, wherever it is. I sincerely appreciate it. I am so excited to have Kate Winkler Dawson back on the show. She joined me 7 years ago to talk about serial killer John Reginald Christie, and we followed that interview a couple of years later with a conversation about the American Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Edward Oscar Heinrich. In the meantime, she's become a very successful podcaster with shows like Wicked Words and Buried Bones. And she's got a new book out on January 7th called The Sinners All Bow, 2 authors, 1 murder, and the Real Hester Prynne. Great to have you back. Congratulations on your new book and all of your podcasting success.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I always love coming here. I feel like I'm with you every couple of years, and I guess I am.
That's true, yeah. So I know you're like me. We get suggestions from our listeners about cases. In this murder case involving Sarah Maria Cornell, this was something, right, that was first brought to your attention by one of your listeners?
Sort of. It's a weird story. I had somebody email me and say it was for my first podcast, Tenfold More Wicked. And she said, I really want you to look into this case. It's called the Haystack Murders. And that's all she said. And so I Googled Haystack Murders, and the case of Sarah Maria Cornell popped up, 1832, New England. This is not what the woman meant. She meant a case. Now I really should look it up. It's, I think it was in Kansas. And it was if somebody found dead in a haystack, but it was not a 30-year-old woman, and it was not in the 1800s. So completely different haystack murders. But it led me to this story about Sarah Maria Cornell, which has been just one of the most honors I've had in my life is to be able to write her story.
Yeah, so you had an interesting source at your disposal. It's a book called Fall River, an authentic narrative, written by a woman named Catharine Read Williams, and it was published in 1833. And in your book, you refer to her as your co-author, right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's interesting because, she died in 1872. I started looking at my sources, and I think Catharine's book was, to me, just a no-brainer. It's an incredible narrative story that she wrote. It's nonfiction. She did a lot of really great journalistic work on it. So much so that I realized, she needed credit because she did a lot of interviews with Sarah Maria Cornell's family that, of course, I would have no access to now. And the police didn't interview, and the press didn't interview them, and or they chose not to speak to these people, but her sister, her mother, her brother-in-law spoke to Catharine. And so she had all of these exclusive stories and anecdotes, and she went to the trial. So she was able to paint this picture that I wanted to include in the book because I couldn't be there. I could do a lot of stuff that she wasn't able to do. I have a lot of forensic tools that I can tap now. I had prosecutors' notes that weren't released until after Catharine died. There's a lot of stuff. I have their families, everybody's families now, who have a lot more information about the lives of the people involved with this case. And so I just decided, well, Catharine needs credit, and I want to work alongside her as much as I can and use her material. But then things got pretty sketchy, I guess is the right word, because I realized that she had these biases that were, I think in some ways for me were drawing away from her credibility. And so, she had condemned the suspect from the very beginning, just the beginning of it. And I said, I need to take a look at this case, and I want to see if I can re-examine it, even though it's, several hundred years old. I want to re-examine it with modern tools, and I want to use Catharine's notes, but I can't fully trust what she's saying because she just despised the suspect so much.
It was groundbreaking, too, for its time, right?
Mm-hmm.
She crafted a new genre, you write,
Yeah.
a victim-centric, story-driven, fact-checked narrative.
Right. And this had not happened before. So this is, America's first true crime book. And when we think about touchstones in true crime storytelling, of course, everybody goes back to In Cold Blood, which I have my own issues with. And then, I go back further to Edmund Pearson, who wrote fantastic stories, at the turn of the century. But in his books, they were mostly anthologies. They were not tackling one big case. And so when I read Fall River, and Catharine's account of it really, I mean, when you start reading the way that academics consider her as an author, it was the first time somebody had, as you said, fused facts with narrative, with analysis, like you are in the moment and she is taking you through all of the evidence. And then when you think that you've had too many facts, she'll bring in the emotion from Lucretia Rawson, who was the victim's sister. And so, she does an excellent job crafting a narrative that was never, no one had ever written that type of nonfiction true crime story before. And I think that the story itself was so compelling that Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter, patterned Hester Prynne after Sarah Maria Cornell. I mean, the parallels are pretty incredible between the two. I think most academics think that that's what happened. He saw a depiction of the suspect and Sarah Maria Cornell in a wax museum. And so he wrote about that. We knew that he wrote about that he had read a lot of the newspaper accounts of the case. So it's very clear that this is a story that resonated with him. And then he, created one of the greatest novels ever written.
Absolutely. Yeah, so maybe we can talk a bit about Sarah Maria Cornell, her early life, and how she eventually found her way to Fall River, Massachusetts.
Sure. I mean, I was in disbelief about this, but she is a Cornell from the Cornell family, of Cornell University, a very famous family. Her grandfather was kind of considered he was one of the founders of Norwich, Connecticut. He was a very well-known patriot during the American Revolutionary War. He housed, soldiers, and he hosted George Washington. And so she comes from this family that has a lot of money, and they're really well known. I've been to her family's home in Connecticut. And then what happens to Sarah's mother is what happens to women in this book, which is they meet the wrong person. So my co-author, Catharine Williams, I think one of the reasons why Sarah's story really resonated with her was she made a terrible choice for a husband and got pregnant and ended up divorcing him after just 1 or 2 years of marriage. And it must have been, she was very vague about why she divorced him, but it must have been terrible because it was like, it would take like an act of God for a woman to get a divorce in this time period from a man. So, I think Catharine was very wary of men, and she felt awful for women who made choices like she made. So Sarah, her mother, who was named Lucretia, made a bad choice. Sarah's family was the Leffingwell family, which was a very famous family. And Lucretia ends up dating one of the men in Thomas Leffingwell, her father's paper mills. And the father says, I forbid this. Lucretia says, I'm in love with him. And when ultimately he ends up getting her pregnant twice, 3 times, and they move when Sarah's father eventually leaves the family, her mother goes back to beg her father to take them all back into this wonderful home, with this famous family, and he rejected her. And so Sarah's lot in life had been struggle, I think. She ended up living with an aunt for a while. She was trained as a tailor. She became an excellent weaver and an excellent tailor, and was going, I think, along really well. She made 1 or 2 mistakes, and the mistakes were stealing from a store in Providence, Rhode Island, and when she was young. And this might not seem like a big deal. This might seem like just like a youthful mistake, but in this time period, this was it would be a capital case. You could be executed for thieving. So
Right.
Sarah, stole a couple of different items a couple of different times. She was caught. She was not jailed or anything like that, but her reputation just never recovered, and so it followed her. So when she became a factory worker, every time I think she felt like she was in a great position, there was somebody there to say, "But she's a thief." And then when she was kind of seeing men, "But she sleeps with men." And so she never can quite climb out of this reputation of hers of being less than a lady. And ultimately, we would see that play out through this whole story.
Right. One of the aspects to her personality that I found so interesting while reading your book was how she reacted in pressure-filled situations. She kind of alternated between laughing and crying.
Right.
It's so interesting that specific detail you were able to get from this person
Yeah.
who died so long ago. It just makes her so real.
Yeah, I think, the blessing of writing in the 1800s, the blessing of writing a story that's set in the 1800s is a lot of times you will have trial transcripts, and so you have people there describing her consistently, not just to, not just in court, but privately to Catherine. She just seemed like she had a lot of anxiety, and her reaction was sometimes she would laugh, sometimes she would cry. She was just sort of had that bubbling, I'm like this, a little bubbling anxiety underneath my skin. And, this was certainly interpreted as manic and crazy, and she's a lunatic and erratic. And, of course, this is a time of corsets and of women who are supposed to be very prim and proper and not act out. It's also a time where a man could think that you are acting a man in your life could think that you're acting erratic and, have you committed to, a mental health facility. So,
Yeah.
Sarah the way that people interpret Sarah to me is like, my kid just did that the other day. I mean, it just seems sort of normal, somebody who is going through emotions and she works 14-hour days, but they really interpreted that to mean that she is legitimately crazy.
Yeah, yeah. So at some point, right, she meets a Methodist minister named Ephraim Avery.
Mhm.
Would you talk about their interactions, their relationship?
Yeah, the relationship is contested from every end. So, I mean, I can say what I feel like I know that Ephraim Avery has basically has denied knowing her more than just as a congregant, and that's it. Sarah had told her family that she went to his house. She had gone to several of his sermons. He was a Methodist minister. She had converted a few years earlier from sort of a mainstream Protestant, Congregationalist church. She had converted to them being Methodist, and the Methodists had quite a reputation in the 1800s. I had not heard of this, and like my agent was raised Methodist, and she was just dumbfounded by the description of Methodists who in the 1800s were having these raucous tent revivals and lots of alcohol and music and the spirit taking over people and speaking in tongues and lots of writhing, lots of sex, people getting pregnant. I mean, just like debauchery and fun in some ways, it sounds like, but it was looked down upon by the more conservative denominations. And the Methodists were very threatening to other denominations, I think, too, because it was just they were attracting a lot of people like Sarah, like these factory women who were working. And so Sarah, was a devout with the Methodist church. She gave them a lot of money. She was very altruistic. She gave them a lot of money. She worked really hard. She went to as many services as she could. She would go to these tent revivals, which could be 2, 3, 4 days long. And, when she met Ephraim Avery, she needed a job. She went to his house. She says she worked for him for a time, like, doing housekeeping work. He was married. He had a couple of kids. And he says she never made it past the front door, that his wife took one look at her. She was attractive, and by all accounts, and his wife took one look at her and said, "No, this is not gonna happen." So already we have differing accounts of the depth of the relationship. The report was that his little boy said that daddy kissed Sarah Maria Cornell, And, of course he denied it. There's so much contradictory information out there. But ultimately, you have a situation where you have Sarah Maria Cornell, who is, part of this church, but her reputation continues to follow her. A lot of it is, according to my co-author, a lot of it is unearned, like disappearing from men, away from men. There were reports that she had gone to see a doctor for venereal diseases. No credible doctor has actually said that's what happened. So you have this reputation, and no one in the Methodist Church would give her a certificate of good standing, which she needed. When you get booted from one church, you need to take your certificate to the next church to say, well, it didn't work out here, but she is a good person and she would be a great contributor to your church. And she went to Ephraim Avery because that's who she knew. And he said, you have to write down all your sins before I can give you this. You have to confess all your sins in writing, which I had never heard of before. And she does it, and he refuses. He keeps the letter, and he refuses to give her a certificate of good standing. So in 1832, when she is found hanging by her neck on a haystack pole on a very cold, desolate farm in what was Tiverton, Rhode Island, what is now Fall River, Massachusetts. When she is found, it's discovered that she's pregnant. And her doctor says, I think this was suicide because, she was trying to get money out of the father of the baby. And, he must have said no. And then she took her own life. And then when it's discovered that she has marks of violence all over her body, that's where this all kicks off. But it becomes a huge he said, she said, where the she part of the equation is gone. So it is a he said. And the character witnesses who are disparaging her, and there are not many people who can defend Sarah. And that's why this story was important to me. I wanted to, by the time I finished the end of the book, I was convinced of several things. One of them was that I needed to be an advocate for Sarah, which is not my nature. I'm a journalist. I like to be in the center. I wanted to give Ephraim Avery a fair shake. I wanted to look at all the evidence, talk to my experts here, read all of the letters, and kind of give a fair assessment of what I think happened. And I did. But as I went through this, I just got angrier and angrier because this was a young woman who had a good future. I mean, she made a couple of tiny, stupid decisions about taking a dress, and it just doomed her.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. Avery had a strange little setup at his house where he would basically have a parade of young women rotating through his study, and he would meet them privately, and this area was kind of separated from the rest of the house.
It's true, but the problem with the story is it's Catharine, right? She's the one telling me that story.
Right.
These are not stories that I can verify because they don't come up in trial, because they were immaterial to trial, right? So I don't doubt that these stories existed. And I don't doubt that he was fooling around with young women, behind closed doors. But looking for verifiable proof of that was problematic. It was based on her interviews. I would think, yes, that happened just because his character just seems so nasty. But this is what I mean. I have a mild credibility issue with Catharine because she hated the Methodists, hated them, hated him, hated them. And when you have that amount of emotion in a piece that's supposed to be based on journalism, that makes me feel very uncomfortable because I want to know, well, you have a dog in the fight here. I mean, how am I supposed to believe anything you say? So I had to work. I mean, I have hard enough trouble policing myself when I write a book. Now I have to police this lady, and I have to look at 9 different types of trial transcripts, and I have to figure out who do I believe, with the defense or the prosecutor, what's the evidence? And so it was a lot to untangle for me.
Right. So back for a moment, if that's okay, to the scene of the suicide/murder. It was a murder, right? Is there any question in your mind? I mean, the word murder is in the title of your book.
Yeah, I would say it was, can I say definitively it was murder? No. Can I say 99% sure? Yes.
Yeah.
the reality is when I talked to a forensic non-expert, when they were saying when the people in 1832 examining her were saying, well, this clove hitch knot that's around her neck, she couldn't have tied it. It's not suicide. She couldn't have tied it herself, right?
Yeah.
The non-experts I talked to said, yeah, she could have. Absolutely. So automatically there you have suicide in play. I think with all of this violence against her body, I think that, with the circumstances with the Methodist minister, I think just all with her complete repulsion about, from her letters about suicide, she felt very strongly against it. She was really religious, and she describes seeing people taking their own life and how uncomfortable it made her and how she would never do that herself. I mean, she literally says stuff like this. But like, could she have done this stuff to herself? Yes. Do I think so? No. But I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm someone who always thinks about I'm uncomfortable with words like definitely or definitive or anything like that. You know? Because
Yeah.
because I can look at this and I say, can I absolutely prove it? No. I mean, they couldn't prove it in 1833 that she didn't do this to herself. But who knows? I mean, so think about this. Like, think about what if Ephraim Avery shows up at the farm and they do get into an argument and he roughs her up. Maybe he's trying to get her to terminate the pregnancy. And then he says, I hate you. I'm leaving. Don't talk to me again. I'm not helping you with this baby. And he walks away. And then she's so distraught that she takes her own life.
Right.
That's a possibility too. Do I think that happened? No, I don't think that happened, but it is a thing that's out there. And so I'm always uncomfortable with but this definitely happened kind of feeling, because I don't know. There are other possibilities.
Absolutely. So John Durfee is the person who finds her body.
Mhm.
It's cut down very quickly, and the locals really spring into action. And then there is this really interesting division of labor by gender. The coroner's jury was made up of men.
Yep.
They refused to examine Sarah's body beyond surface level. Her clothes were not removed.
Mhm.
But once her body was handed over to the town's matrons,
Mhm.
a group of women who were responsible for preparing the body for burial,
Mhm.
they found the physical evidence in regards to those bruises, scratches.
Yeah, and I am I spend an incredible amount of time writing about men who kill women. And so in all of these stories, I always look for the heroes and particularly the women who could be heroes. And I think in this book, there were a lot of heroes and there were a lot of villains. And unfortunately, the women were both the heroes and villains in this story. So, what you're referring to is you've got this coroner's jury with these men, which, by the way, I mean, nobody has to have any kind of medical expertise to be on a coroner's jury then and now. I mean, there is no requirement. Then I think it was like you had to own a parcel of land. I mean, there was like a residency requirement, and that was it. And the point of a coroner's jury is to determine how a person died, not if somebody's guilty of anything. And so, they gather and they look at her fully clothed. So they don't undress her because that would be improper, even though her physician is standing right there. So she is destined to be buried as a woman who committed suicide, who took her own life. And the matrons in town were tasked with gathering her clothing. So they sent John Durfee, the owner of the farm, off to go find some clothing at the boarding house where she lived. And in the meantime, they cleaned her up, and that's when they saw what they called rash violence, which were a lot of marks, skin knees, grass stains. I mean, clearly she had been in like a fight. And this was to them incredibly alarming. I'm sure they had seen suicides before, and I'm sure they had seen murders before. And they recognized this as being something that was very suspicious, but they didn't say anything. And then when John Durfee returned with a trunk full of her clothes, they dug around and got her dressed, and then they found some pretty key things. They found letters that were anonymous that Sarah had kept. And they were letters that indicated she needed to go to this particular spot, which ended up being John Durfee's farm, for a secret meeting, a clandestine meeting. And we assumed it was from the father of her child, right? Not signed, all these letters. And then there was a note that said, essentially in 19th century speak, essentially said, if I'm missing, contact Reverend Ephraim Avery. He'll know where I am. And I think over the past 200 years, this has really been framed as a really ominous note. I mean, it's a kind of note that's been repeated through mysteries and thrillers for hundreds of years, like
Yeah.
if I'm missing, my husband did it. And Catherine and I both agree that this was not an ominous note. This was a note that she had written just sort of out of courtesy to say, this is where I'm supposed to be. She was in a great mood when she left. Both of the women who were at the boarding house testified. She was in a wonderful mood. She thought she was going to get money for her child, for her unborn child. She didn't seem scared. She didn't ask anybody to go with her. So, number one, this is not a woman who intended to go out and take her own life, it seems like, at least at the beginning of the evening. But number two, this was also a woman who did not seem to be particularly threatened when she left. She went out at night, a couple of towns over, without a man, to meet a man. So she felt safe to a certain extent.
Right. Also of some possible significance was a bottle or a vial of something called tansy oil.
Oh, gosh.
Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I had to talk to a toxicologist, my friend, about it.
Yeah.
I think the oil of tansy was used in the 1800s for a lot of things. Like, gosh, I mean, it's amazing what poisons were used for in the 1800s. And oil of tansy was a fairly popular way to terminate a pregnancy. It's a poison, and it's a natural poison, but it is something that can be fatal if you take too much of it. And so they find this vial of oil of tansy, and we find out through Catharine, and then later on through the trial transcripts, that she had. Now, Sarah does not name Ephraim Avery, the Reverend Ephraim Avery, to her doctor. He doesn't ever say his name. I mean, we know who it is, and she eventually tells her family who it is. But she's very protective in a way of him. She has been trained to think if anything has gone wrong in her life, that she is to blame, not somebody else. She was a victim of sexual assault, and yet she was petrified of him ruining his career or ending his marriage or something like that, because I think she partially blamed herself. So when she, goes to him and says, I'm pregnant, he responds by saying, terminate the pregnancy, take this. She refused to do it, and she told her doctor, and the doctor said, how much did he, suggest that you take? And she told him, and he said, that would kill you. That would kill like 5 horses. I mean, he's trying to kill you. And so it was the doctor who said multiple times, you need to confront him. You need to get money. He has a responsibility, but don't do it alone. And to me, that's one of the hardest parts of this story, is like, I just wish somebody had gone with her. Not that she had asked, but that, I don't know, that she had not been alone, that she trusted him too much. That it's all very confusing, but ultimately this oil of tansy was another little piece of evidence. Of course, he denied ever giving her any of it or knowing anything about it, but oil of tansy was a very common way to terminate a pregnancy.
Right. And for my listeners, I talked to Evan Rail recently about his book, The Absinthe Forger, and we talked about thujone, and in that interview, and tansy oil contains thujone. So Dr. Wilbur, he's such a central figure in this story, and he becomes a very important witness in Avery's trial. And he recalls this conversation he had with Sarah, which you've talked about some already. But he really, really presses her for details about her intimate life, which is a little uncomfortable to read on one hand, but in hindsight, obviously very, very helpful, right? to the case to you as you piece this together?
Yeah, and I think, and again, you have to keep in mind, this is the conversation that Catherine said she made very clear from the beginning of the book. There's one conversation where I kind of massaged the details, not the spirit, but like to make it sound, I don't know if it was the conversation that Sarah and Dr. Wilbur had. She was sort of saying, I did it for clarity. I changed some words around for clarity, but that everything is completely accurate. But I have no doubt that he did pry. I think he really saw Sarah as like a daughter figure, and he felt badly for her. And so there was a lot of key things that came out. I mean, number one, the oil of tansy was a really big deal. That revelation that this man had asked her to take a fatal dose of oil of tansy, that she would eventually admit to him that she had been sexually assaulted, that this was not some like would-be lover or boyfriend, and this was a minister. And Dr. Wilbur was just horrified by that a Methodist minister would do something like that. And, he insisted to her many times, you have to hold him accountable. Her sister said the same thing, and so did her brother-in-law. And and went as far as to find her an attorney who said, you've got to move to his state. You need to move so that you can essentially sue him for child support there. And that's really what kicked a lot of this off. But I think the conversation with Dr. Wilbur, he's another hero here. He really made the connection between the matrons made the connection between um, Sarah was a suicide or murder, and they said, and they raised enough red flags to say this was murder. We need to, you need to investigate this more. Had the matrons not intervened, this would not have been a case. I believe it was the matrons who figured it out. But Dr. Wilbur gave context. This is the minister she was talking about. This is what she said the relationship was like, which was not an actual relationship. It was a disjointed power struggle and, a man who was excellent at manipulating a young woman and a woman who was just incredibly vulnerable. So all of these conversations with Dr. Wilbur, I'm so grateful that Sarah had them because I don't think she had a great guide in life. Dr. Wilbur was just about the only person who, I read who she was seeing in person, and she'd only seen him maybe 3 or 4 or 5 times, who she had seen in person, who just was real with her and said, this is kind of what needs to happen. So I thought it was interesting. I'm glad that they had those conversations.
Right. And he was one of her defenders after her death.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of people did turn against her. You write that the Methodists rallied around Avery.
Mm-hmm.
But then there was this other group of factory owners too. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so this is the way I had always understood the story. So everything I read, and academic articles and books and everything, they had always sort of framed this story as this. A young woman is found dead hanging from a haystack pole. She had had an affair, which I know is not true. She had had an affair with a Methodist minister. He is accused of murdering her. They become avatars for 2 different groups. There is the Methodists that they'd only been in America. John Wesley came 50 years earlier to America, and they were a huge threat to all of the other religions. And it was, they were being tarred and feathered. And so this is the last thing the Methodists needed was for a minister to be accused of murder. So when he goes on trial, they hire the best of the best. They hire senators, and congressmen to defend, well-known people to defend this guy, who was just a sort of average minister. He was not, huge in leadership. He was just a guy, an average guy, but he represented all of them. And they were already struggling to begin with. They were trying to convert people. They were doing these these missions, circuit rider missions out to the West to get more followers. So they were trying to expand. They did not need this kind of publicity. And then the other faction that you had mentioned is the conventional mainstream Protestant Catharine Williams type people who, sat in their churches, and their ministers might be boring, but they were trained and they were not passionate. They were methodical. and academic in some ways. And so these are the factory owners. These are the industrialists who have come into New England and built all of these factories along the water, who are hiring these young women. So then the narrative becomes the Methodists have to get him acquitted, because if they don't, it will discredit, disparage, whatever you want to say about their religion, because now there is a rapist and a murderer among them. But the mainstream Protestant, the factory owners, they have to have him convicted, because if they don't, then you have all of these families in New England and really across the country who have been waiting to send their daughters to these factories to gain independence, maybe to find a husband, to, send money home, who are now all of a sudden not going to feel safe sending their daughter to a factory, because look what happened to that girl, Sarah Maria Cornell. They weren't looking after her properly. They let her go and join the Methodist Church. There is a promise between the factory owners and the families that they will take care of these young women. And so there's a lot at stake. But I kind of started thinking, this is not the story that I want. I mean, these are important, and this is what makes the story compelling, and it was why it was a national story, and it was a fight between, sort of these monsters in religion. But at the same time, for me, it was a story about a young woman who was trying to do the best she could, and she was being blamed for things that she shouldn't have been blamed for. And when it came down to it, the people who betrayed her the most, not just Ephraim Avery, I would put him to the side. It is all of those women who she thought were her friends, who were members of the Methodist Church, who got on the stand and very clearly lied just to get this guy out of trouble. So, that to me is the story. And that's why I go back to the Scarlet Letter and Hester Prynne. It is the women in the Scarlet Letter who are the most vicious. They are the worst. They are just relentless. And that is exactly what happened to Sarah Maria Cornell. And I felt so badly for her by the end. She just wanted to go to heaven. She wanted to be a good person. And she settled on the fact that she was going to be a single mother, and she wanted to make it work. And that's why she was there on that farm that night. And that's why she died.
Right. And she believed in heaven. She wanted to go to heaven.
Yeah.
It was important to her, and very likely a reason why suicide was not an option for her.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think she felt repulsed by it, disturbed by it. And, again, I'm somebody who I'm uncomfortable with the superlative, with an absolute. I think things can change in a moment. I've seen people, I've reported on stories where people make decisions quickly without thinking, and then that's the end of their life. And I
Right.
would never say that is out of the realm of possibility. Of course, that could have happened with Sarah. It is unlikely, though. It is very unlikely that she went there and either without meeting anyone or with meeting Ephraim Avery and then he left, then took her own life. That's unlikely. It doesn't fit her victimology, and it also really doesn't fit the evidence.
Right. Yes. I do want to ask you about John Durfee. He remembered seeing a tall man
Mm-hmm.
in dark clothing about a quarter of a mile from the haystack pole.
Yeah.
What was the importance of that testimony?
I think there were a lot of witnesses who saw somebody who looked a lot like Ephraim Avery near their property. And of course, with John Durfee, he remembered it because I think this was his testimony. He remembered it because there were two men who were blasting rock nearby, and this tall guy seemed clueless, and he wasn't moving, even though they were getting ready to, explode rock right next to him. And so I think that caught John Durfee's attention, and he was able to describe the person. But again, with witnesses, I mean, it was, they said, I've never met him before. I don't know. It looks like him, but the best description they got was somebody who was tall and lanky and wore a particular kind of hat and a particular kind of jacket. So there was no one who could definitively put him there.
Absolutely, yeah. You are fortunate that that your co-host on Buried Bones is Paul Holes, and he was able to offer his own insight, right, about some of the forensic clues left behind.
Yeah, I mean, he, along with the forensic non-expert I spoke to, were the ones who said, when I said, "Well, this is bananas," they say that there's no way that she could have tied this clove hitch knot herself. And, I had read a lot of people had felt like that, and Paul was the one and the not expert. Both of them said, "No, yeah, she could have done it." And it could have happened accidentally too. It happens. So I did not know that. I think that Catharine made a really big deal in her book about a handkerchief that had like what appeared to be saliva on it, and it was laying on the ground and it was wet. And that one person said it looked like she had been gagged, and that was the presumption. And then Catharine thought that or that it was tears. It was wet from tears, that she had this sort of agonized look on her face. And Paul just said that that account doesn't make a lot of sense. You wouldn't really be able to tell what the liquid is, but it was most likely dew from overnight. It was a freezing night. So I think there are a lot of little details, particularly, Paul said, I said, I want to make sure I can trust the matrons when they say when they say rash violence, that means somebody else committed violence against her. And he finally settled on and said, he was kind of getting into the nitty gritty. He's like, well, what kind of cut here? What kind of, scrape there? How big is the scrape? And does it look like it's going in one direction, like she got dragged? And finally, he just said, well, I said, listen, these women in the 1800s would have experienced violence. I mean, I would guess more than half of them probably were victims of domestic violence at some point in their life. And he said, yeah. And then he said, I would probably trust them. If they think this was violence, then I would say it's violence too, that somebody
Yeah.
else inflicted on her. And I think the big deal were that a couple of the women said that there were large handprints on her hips. Paul said that sounded like that could be an attempted termination of pregnancy. And I said, yeah, that's, I think, what I thought and what they thought too. You could see these imprints. And so it was just a lot of that kind of interpretation. I think that was really important, like the lividity and, where the blood goes and how long somebody's been laying there and what the decomposition, like there was a rumor going around that somebody had broken her arm in the fight. And it turns out that the matrons had to break her arm essentially just to get her arm down. It had been in rigor and had to get down to fit into the coffin. So I think there were a lot of details that were really helpful for me, for sure.
Her body was disinterred twice, right?
Yeah, I mean, poor woman. Well, the second
Yeah.
time it was, and then the second time really it was disinterred because he had to move her after the trial was gone. It was done. It was like a third time, I think, where he had to move her permanently out to Oakwood Cemetery, and how sort of difficult that is. I think that that's a really I he had so many looky-loos on the property that John Durfee said she can't stay here, so that's where she lays now. But disinterring her twice, I mean, as Paul would say, especially because this is before embalming, so, she would have deteriorated pretty quickly. Luckily, it was in the winter, so it slowed down the decomposition, but still, every time, she had, like, grave rot, and you could see mold. I mean, every time you take somebody out of the ground like that when they haven't been embalmed, there's more deterioration, and then that means, you have less and less to work with.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. There was some controversy, correct, about whether the Methodist Church would allow her to be buried inside of their cemetery.
Yeah, that was one of the big deals. Was I think that's when everybody on this farm that day became alarmed when Ira Bidwell, who was a reverend above Ephraim Avery, came to report because he heard that one of his congregates had died. And so Dr. Wilbur speaks to him and says, "Do you know anything about her?" And he says, "Yes, she was a wonderful person. She was a great congregant. She gave money, blah, blah, and he says, "Well, will you pay for the burial?" Because that was a very common practice. And he said, "Well, let me check things out. I'm sure we can work out something." And then Dr. Wilbur stops him and says, "Listen, she says that she was assaulted by one of your ministers. And this means Dr. Bidwell is taken aback, and he goes and actually, I don't even know if he said assaulted. It was like maybe an affair, or she was pregnant and it was because of Ephraim Avery. And he reports to Ephraim Avery, who goes ballistic. And then when Dr. Bidwell returns, the story is totally different. She was a vile girl. She was not a good congregant. We would not have her back into the church. No, she can't be buried with, the people in our church. So it was a big change based on Ephraim Avery.
And that is basically his defense. He focuses on Sarah's character and accuses her of being deceptive, immoral, slippery.
Yeah. Yeah. All of those things, setting him up, essentially. She's trying to frame him, is what he's saying.
Was there sympathy for him in regards to that strategy?
Yes. I mean, Sarah, there were some, when she was accused and confessed to stealing a couple of different items of clothing years earlier, when the shopkeepers testified, if you believe the shopkeepers, and I actually do, when they track her down, her reaction to stress and anxiety is to either laugh or cry hysterically. Now, I mean, like, I have a kid who does the same thing. I mean, I don't,
Sure.
I'm not taken aback by that. But people react differently. Sometimes people shut down and don't say anything when they're under the gun. And sometimes they react in a completely different way. But she was certainly framed as a lunatic. I mean, there's no other way to say it. They said she is erratic, she is unstable, and then all of that plays into this label of her being not just crazy, but then vindictive. When Ephraim Avery says, "You're too bad of a girl for me to give you a certificate of good standing so you can go to another church. I'm not giving it to you." The way he says she responds is, "Well, I'm going to kill myself, and then I'm going to take you down with me by saying that you did it and frame you for murder." I mean, that's essentially what people who took the stand said that she had insinuated she would do. Now, do I believe any of these people? No. I mean, that not based on what I know. Paul says victimology is one of the most important things you can establish in a case. And I read every single one of Sarah's letters, everything in the trial transcripts. I felt like I know her really well. I think she was a young woman who had no North Star. She didn't have anybody to guide her. Her parents didn't live with her. Her dad had abandoned her. And she really was somebody who was kind of unmoored. And I think she just needed kind of a Dr. Wilbur to help guide her a little bit. And so all of these crazy things were not the Sarah Maria Cornell that I got to know. They were lying. All of these people were lying on the stand. And there was no one legitimate who said, "Yes, I heard her say something like this." But that was the narrative that they came up with. And we know now all you need to do to doom somebody is to figure out that narrative. What is that label that you can put on that person that will repulse people? And it doesn't have to be real. It's just a label that makes people say there is not going, this is something that's going to be, I don't want to be involved with this person, Like, I mean, you could look at what happens with Blake Lively and this debate back and forth with these lawsuits with an actress and how she's labeled and then she's not labeled and then she's labeled. And I mean, it's just like, once you get a label on you, it's really hard to get it off. And Sarah didn't have enough people protecting her. There weren't enough people there. The Methodist Church tracked down all the women that she worked with, and they were all members of the church. And they all had a motive to either lie or exaggerate. And they had a really big motive to not cross the church. So that's where we end up with her character being absolutely impugned on the stand.
Yeah. And Avery had an alibi that night, right?
I mean, a terrible one. I would say, though, I don't know,
Yeah.
Eric, I don't know how you feel about this, but like, I would have a terrible alibi most nights because I would just be like at home by myself or, in my cottage in my backyard where I could sneak out and kill someone if I needed to. He did have an awful alibi. He was on, I call it a walkabout. He was on like a walkabout. On an island where he encountered people, but they were people who didn't know him, I read to Paul Holes some of his description of what he did that day, and it was so detailed. It was like the white picket fence that was 5 feet tall pickets, and this little boy was wearing a red striped. And I read the whole thing, and he said, "Yeah, that sounds like a lot of lies. Nobody has that much detail." He said, "Yeah, can you even describe the lunch you ate and how many tomatoes were in it today?" And I said, "No." And he said, "That's why it's really hard to describe something like that, you know?"
Yeah, exactly. There are a couple of things that I want to ask you about, things that Catharine Williams put particular emphasis on, evidence-wise. One was the cloak.
Mhm.
Sarah was found in a heavy cloak. And Catharine, correct, questioned
Mhm.
whether someone would commit suicide wearing something heavy like that. And then secondly, the gloves, which didn't have any marks on them.
Yeah, I talked to Paul about that. I don't know about the cloak situation. I think if she's cold, I think anybody would do anything. I don't question the way that people dress when they take their own lives, or I don't know if I bought that line. I would say that out of propriety, I couldn't see her not wearing a cloak and when it's 25 degrees outside, and she would want to be dressed appropriately. I mean, knowing her character, if this is something that she really was gonna do. One of my points was the marline, rope, which was, the contention that there would be residue on her hands. And, Paul and I talked about that, and he said, "Yeah, but if it's freezing outside, you might not have any kind of residue on your hands at all." And I have some of that exact type of rope, and I tested it. And, there was stuff that came off a little bit on my hands, but he said, "You just can't without having that exact rope. Was it covered was it covered with tar? Was the tar frozen? If it was covered with tar, maybe it wouldn't have gone on her at all if it was frozen." So there was just so much kind of guessing about that. I mean, again, that's the problem with doing a story from 200 years ago.
Absolutely. So was Avery's reputation permanently tarnished from this? Did it follow him forever?
No, ultimately, he is not convicted, and he is essentially booted out. I think a lot, had to do with Catherine's book, which was a really big seller. I think they, printed it 2 or 3 times, reprinted it, which is a big deal. He got booted out essentially of, New England, and he ended up in Ohio, which is how I met his descendant, who is an Avery in Ohio. And he actually sent me a picture of the house that is still there that Ephraim Avery and his wife and Sophia and their kids lived in. And he lived a quiet life. Reportedly, nothing happened after that. He never talked about it. He had a good reputation there at the end. And I think he was like an undertaker or a mortician for a little bit. So, which is odd, and he's buried right across the street, right across the road from that house. So, he did not achieve whatever fame he was going for, but it didn't seem to ruin his life. It just seemed to change his life, which frankly is too bad. It would have been better to ruin his life.
Right. Yes. So one of the purposes for you write, in investigating this case was to see if you would end up drawing the same conclusions that Catharine Williams did.
Right. Yep.
And I won't press you on that. Readers can learn about those conclusions. But that was one of your goals, correct?
It was. I mean, I think that when I read all of the details she had, I was so impressed. And then when I kept reading the context and how she was sort of skewing things, and I felt like we needed to take a really good. I couldn't trust her as much as I hoped I could. I needed to take another look at the case through a 21st century lens and, just through my own expertise and just sort of evaluate the case myself. What makes sense, with this story, and come to my own conclusions, hire my own people. So I was very happy with the ending, and I felt like the book really represented Sarah Maria Cornell well. And, I wish that this was never a book I had been able to write. I wish that this had never happened to her, that this was not a story. But thank goodness those women spotted those marks. Otherwise, this would have been just another sad suicide and not a murder.
And one more thing. I do want to briefly add, I enjoyed the parallels that you make throughout your book between the figures in situations in this case and the ones in the Scarlet Letter. For people listening who are familiar with the Scarlet Letter, which I would imagine is a lot of you, it's fun to see the comparisons you make.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, let's end on a positive note here. One thing that Hawthorne wanted to do was mirror in Hester Prynne, Sarah Maria Cornell's just desire, devotion to community. She talks about, Catharine talks about interviewing a woman who felt like Sarah could have potentially been promiscuous, but she wasn't sure. She disappeared with a man around the corner, but then came right back. And it was just too much for her to deal with in her own household. And so she kicked out Sarah, but kicked her out the next day, so she was able to spend the night. And in that night, she took care of one of the woman's very, very sick relatives. And, the woman who kicked her out for no good reason said, "I regret it now. I regret it." She was a wonderful person who was giving. And, she just said, "I understand why you're kicking me out." And that's it. And that you see that in the Scarlet Letter. You see Hester Prynne helping people who won't even acknowledge her publicly, but then they come begging for her help or with, and with her needlework. And so I think that, these are both two women who, they know their worth, and they just were treated so poorly, particularly by other women. And I hope that's a lesson.
Absolutely. Well, this has been so great. I so appreciate your time. Thank you.
Sure.
And I'll mention, too, your book is out on January 7th.
Yep, you got it.
I'll put a link to your website in the show notes. But your name is pretty easy to find on the internet. There's a lot about you all over, and in the most positive way possible.
Good. I like to hear that.
Well, I appreciate this again, Kate. Thank you.
Sure. I appreciate it. Let me know if y'all need anything, okay?
Yes, will do. Again, I've been speaking to Kate Winkler Dawson. Her brand new book is called The Sinners All Bow. 2 authors, 1 murder, and the Real Hester Prynne. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.